All right, so correct. It is what it is. It's the technology I have. All right, so we're gonna, like I said, kind of take some notes. If you wrote a big K next to something and I pulled a definition up, then you're obviously good on it. If the definition looks familiar, you don't necessarily have to take a note on it. I would take notes on the ones you need a little help with that you can't quite remember. But most of these, I'm assuming, are things that you guys have heard before. In fact, a lot of them I know you have because I've covered them. So who had a big K next to the first term, which was personification, right? Yeah? John, what's personification?
Like you say the truth. The truth.
That would be, yeah. The trees breathing is kind of an odd example, but I get where you're going. Like the wind howled, right? I got the example that'll pop up in a second. So yeah, that's personification, the act of contributing human-like qualities to something that's not human. By the way, I know I didn't give you a lot of room on this. You can take down things that you need to wherever you want. But if you know what that means, again, don't worry about it. Next one I'm not even going to ask because you should know this. Imagery is descriptive language. It's painting an image in the reader's head. There's an example of personification. Cupcake is calling to her. It's not literally calling to her. Cupcake is. If your cupcake is, get up and run away. Okay, next term I think is onomatopoeia. Is that right?
Yeah.
We got a K next to that. Eli.
I know this one. It's like, well, I'm not like, you put me on the spot.
Oh no! You raised your hand. No.
Everybody else
I have a funny thing to say.
A word that imitates the sound is called onomatopoeia.
Thank you, Noah. The people that aren't here today are really going to miss out on that. Yeah, sound words. Yeah, like buzz,
Buzz.
bang, wow,
I started to confuse it with hyperbole, and I'm like, wait.
the pooey. Okay, I'm going to assume meter was the one you may not be as clear on, and meter is the rhythm of a poem. And that's what we're going to dive into a little deeper today when we look at this poem in a few moments. Meter is a poem's rhythm or beat. And rhythms or beats are actually created by syllables. I know you know what syllables are. They're parts of words. You probably, yeah, there we go. See, someone yesterday said you didn't clap out syllables in kindergarten.
I do that still.
Or today. So syllables are the things you clap out. Now the difference between stressed and unstressed syllables is what we'll get into today. That's the part that's a little trickier, but that's what creates rhythm or meter in poetry. And when you think of meter, it sounds complicated, but just remember this example. What do you use meter for in other classes?
Measure.
Meter sticks to measure stuff, right? So meter in English is not that different. You measure a poem's rhythm with meter. Okay? You measure a poem's rhythm with meter. The most common form of meter is what we call iambic meter. Iambic meter is created by iambs. An iamb is a pair of syllables, and the first syllable is unstressed. The following syllable is stressed. Again, I know that probably doesn't make sense yet. We'll talk about the difference between unstressed and stressed syllables shortly. Okay, I'll give you an example in the poem we read today. So the most common form of meter is probably iambic pentameter. You guys remember learning about that? Probably with Shakespeare, sonnets, plays, poems. Yeah. So iambic pentameter is created by 5 iambs. Pentameter tends to be 5.
We're doing some beyond.
Yeah, there we are. Are you kidding me?
I got coffee.
Shakespeare might have been.
Don't confuse me anymore. I'm already.
We'll get into Eli's conspiracy theories in another class. All right, mood, tone, and diction. You should know these 3. I went over an example about mood and tone the other week. South Park, Family Guy, Saturday Night Live. Remember I told you they have different moods and tones. Right, tone is what the author creates. Mood is how you feel. So that's a big difference. Mood is the atmosphere perceived by the reader. Tone is the author's attitude. And diction is how they create that tone. It's their word choice. All right? Okay, so we're going to next read a poem, and I am going to read it to you guys for our first reading, and then we're going to go back and look at it again a little closer as a class with some questions and a second reading. So that poem you can see there is 3 sections. By the way, what do we call a section of a poem? Stanza, good. So 3 simple stanzas. It's a pretty short poem, you can see. The title's not listed. The title's actually the first line. It's called The Tide Rises, The Tide Falls by a guy named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Okay? And so,
I heard about it.
so to read this, I got to set the scene a little bit. Here we go.
You're not as close to the camera as you usually are. Usually you're really close.
Hey guys, welcome to English.
Noted.
Thanks for tuning in today.
It's not a bad thing.
I used to join the meetings like 10 minutes early, so it'd just be me and him, and I'd be just like eat food and stare at him.
Yes, that is correct. The first time I met Eli, I watched him eat ramen for 10 minutes.
Why would you just stay on there? I would have gotten off.
Well, I was doing things. I was multitasking, but
Every time he looked at the other screen, he was
Just-
okay. The tide rises, the tide falls. Like you can hear. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. A curlew is just a seabird, like a seahawk. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks, the steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. That's like a horse handler. The day returns, but nevermore returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. All right, flip it over. You're going to see 4 questions. So I want you to answer right now. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. Answer number 1. Answer number 2. Skip number 3, because we're going to do that one together. It asks about meter or rhythm. And do number 4. When you get to number 4, it asks about a theme. Remember, we've talked about theme a lot now this year. Do not give me a cliche like, don't judge a book by its cover, which, by the way, has nothing to do with this poem. But I'm just giving you an example of a cliche, okay? So take 5 minutes to do those 3. Is a common expression referring to mortality and the passing of time. The second stanza, what do you think is applied about the fate of the traveler when his footprints are washed away? What did you think, Eli?
I said that he's gonna die and like everything's gonna go away and nobody will remember him.
Okay, hold on to that thought. Have that thought in the back of your head. Does anybody think something else, Michael?
I just said he dies in the ocean and impacted.
Okay, yeah, there's definitely something about death and impact. I can tell you guys that, okay? All right, so let's go over the division of time in the stanzas again. Michael, you said this correctly when you just said it. In the first stanza, we have dusk, twilight, evening, okay? In the second stanza, we have darkness settles, so it is night, and then the morning quite clearly in the third stanza. Okay, I'm going to come back and finish with number 3. So let's talk about the theme here. So if we have in the first stanza the tide rising and falling, that is obviously a common thing, right? Each final line of each stanza is that same line. The tide rises, the tide falls, right? So that's an important point to note. Repetition is always important. We also have the fact that we have this traveler, an unknown traveler, which means it could be anybody. It could be one of us, right? But someone who's traveling, hastening towards town. What does it mean to hasten towards something? To hurry, right? So in the evening, the traveler is hurrying. Then darkness comes and his footprints get washed away, which we can interpret as him dying, right? That's what some of you said. We know this. If he dies, if he doesn't die, whatever. He doesn't come back the next day, right? The traveler never returns to the shore. So regardless of that, the morning breaks, and what happens the next morning when the sun rises? No, besides that, we're not talking about the traveler now. We're talking about everything around him.
Everything goes on.
Everything goes on. Right, so the tide keeps rising and falling, right, as it always will. The people in the town wake up. They get to their errands with the horses, right? And so the poem, again, whether or not the guy dies, isn't that important. It's the fact that the poem, whatever you have for your theme, is all about, this is kind of an illustration, I guess, what we would call the cyclical nature of life. Life's cycles, right? So the fact that he's an unknown traveler, again, going back to what I said earlier, could be any of us, right? We're all travelers. We're all travelers on the journey of life. And we all have a final destination. And sometimes, depending on how you live your life, your footprints are washed away. But we all hope that that's not the case, right? That we leave a legacy for others. Well, that's not the case, okay? So, that's what the poem's about. Now, let's look at the meter here. The meter in the third line specifically. So that is this one. All right, so I said earlier when we talked about meter or rhythm, it's a measurement of unstressed versus stressed syllables. So I'm going to break down now for you the difference between the two. We're going to start with the word, well, let's just start with the first word in that stanza. And by the way, this is what I recommend. When you're trying to figure out the meter of a line of poetry, and this is just a quick taste today. We're going to look at this more second semester. We have a whole poetry unit second semester. So Noah, maybe you can read your spoken word then. But for now, we're just going to dive in for one day. So along. I'm sorry. Let me backpedal. When you're diagramming meter, you want to pick a word that has 2 syllables at least that you know how to pronounce. So looking at that third line, what word should we pick?
Along.
Along is the only one with 2 syllables, right? Now, the difference between stressed and unstressed syllables is this. The stressed syllable is the one you spend more time on. It's the one you emphasize. So think about the word along. Which one is stressed? Or long?
Oh.
Long, right? So I'm going to mark long here as stressed. That's not going to work. I'll just do it on the board. So along, we would label the A as a U. It's unstressed. Okay? You can even see it when you divide that word, right? Long, you spend more time on. You say, I was walking along the street, right? You don't say, hey, I was walking along the street. You emphasize the second syllable. And then from there, it's easy because I'm never going to trick you. I'm always going to give you a pattern. So you just alternate. So we would label this U, this S, and then we go U, S, U, S, U, S. Okay? That's the meter. But it's not specific enough. That's just diagramming it. Now we got to figure out what actually meter we got going on here. To do that, you got to circle the pairs. Okay? So looking back at your notes, what do we call a pair? An unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. That is one item. Okay? So in this line, we got a pattern. We've got 4 iams. So we call that iambic tetrameter. All right? You're probably used to the prefix quad for 4, but tetra was the old-fashioned way. Tetra means 4. So iambic tetrameter is what we have. Now, that is not the reason why I'm having you doing that. I totally get when you read poetry, you should enjoy poetry. You shouldn't dissect it like a math problem and be like, oh, what's the meter here? You discovered the meter. But this meter actually relates to the poem's meaning. How? When you look at that, how does that relate to what's going on in the poem? Noah? It's like the tide, right? Off, the, sea, and, round.
So that really matters.
Did the author think about that?
Yeah, because if you get rid of along, the meter's all messed up, right? If it's a different word, it's a totally different rhythm.
I didn't know about it.
Yes.
That's too much work.
Shakespeare was writing way before that, and he was using it. All right, enough. Well, it relates to the poem's meaning, so he did it for a reason. That's why we're looking at it.
Makes me feel so dumb.
I hate poetry.
It's worth it. All seeing.
Okay.
Poetry's good, but sometimes it does get pretentious. I like this one.
All right, so we are going to move on to reviewing for the test on Tuesday. And to do that, I got a review guide for you. But you guys know by now, everything you get is provided in here, but also electronically. The electronic review guide, I'm going to pull up on my screen too, because it's interactive. So that may be even of more help to you. So I'll pull that up in a second here. We're not going to have time to go to the library today. I know I had that up there with a question mark. But I went with my morning classes, and the librarians did confirm no late fines or anything like that. So if you do have a library book, it's not like you get a fine for it. Okay. So test on Tuesday is multiple choice. It's 40 questions, 40 points. And right now I'm going to go over how those different sections break down. So again, your only remote homework for Tuesday is to review for that test. Now that review guide I just gave you, which is right here, that review guide is broken down into different sections. You don't have to do anything with this. This is purely a resource for you. I'm not going to collect it. It's not for a grade. It's for you to be ready for the test. Okay, so the key terms up here. There's 27 terms that we've all covered at some point this year related to literature. Some of them are pretty basic terms. Some of them, like doppelganger, sublime, uncanny, you're probably going to have to go back to your Gothic literature notes and review what that stuff means. But as you can see up here, it says you're expected to know how to apply these to a piece of literature. So you don't need to know specific definitions, okay? It's not a matching section where you need to know exactly word for word what theme means. You need to be able to apply it to a piece of text. And so, like, I'll ask a question and say, hey, what point of view is that line from, okay? So you need to know what this stuff means off the top of your head so you can apply it. Make sense? Question?
So, another example, like is it going to like give you a sample of text?
Right, exactly. There will be a line of something and say like, oh, which word best describes the mood of this?
Okay.
Make sense? Okay. It's all multiple choice. When you get to historical context, these will all be framed as multiple choice questions. So make sure you go over those. You know how to answer them. The resources here for historical context are the background notes we went over. And like I said, the electronic copy here is full of links. So if you need to review something, it'll take you back to either the Dark Romantic notes or to the Transcendentalism notes if you click on it. And then when you get to the authors and literature, on this section, there's a combination of questions. So there will be 4 questions that ask you to match a quote to its author. Okay? Everybody always freaks out about that. Don't freak out. First of all, pick quotes that are meaningful. I'm not going to pick a random quote from something. And then at this point, the whole reason this is a unit test, if I give you a quote from Emerson, you better be able to know what a quote from Emerson looks like and how it might be different than something from Edgar Allan Poe, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you're going to identify quotes based on that. Okay? Match 4 quotes to their authors. Then the rest of the questions about the stuff we actually read, a lot of the questions I pulled directly from study guides. So guess what? I linked all the study guides. So if you go through this and you need to get back to something and see what that study guide looked like, everything's linked here. You, of course, as responsible students, have your own copies with answers filled in somewhere organized, I'm sure. So that's that section. Final section, 13 questions are going to be kind of like a final exam where you're going to have to read a short piece within the testing period and answer 13 questions about it. All right? So there'll be a story we haven't read yet. It might be Transcendentalism based. It might be Dark Romantic based. But it'll be a story we haven't read. It's about 3 pages. No one's ever had trouble reading it within the testing period. You'll read it and answer 13 questions. So to answer those, again, these terms up here are important. Okay? Yes?
Is it 13 or 15?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a typo on yours. It's 13. I changed the test this year. It used to be 15. Any other questions?
No.
All right. You can work together if you want then. We've got about 5 minutes left if you want to start working through that stuff on the review guide.
If I do it now,
No one ever saw Ralph Waldo